a whisper in the firelight, 4 graves, and a widow who never once shed a tear. In a quiet London parlour, something dark has been set in motion, measured not in violence, but in silence, symmetry, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on one of those dim October afternoons, when London seemed determined to turn every window pane into a mirror of grey monotony, that I found myself once more in our rooms at Baker Street. The fire had fallen low, though Holmes made no motion to stir it. He sat cross-legged in his chair, the Stradivarius resting against his shoulder, plucking at it absently as if its strings alone might express what words could not. Outside, the city sulked beneath a steady drizzle, and within, my friend was wrapped in that peculiar stillness that always preceded either the onset of illness or the arrival of a singular case. I had learned by then to fear and revere both with equal measure. Holmes had spoken scarcely a word since breakfast. No deduction about the boot scrape on the hallway carpet, no commentary on Mrs. Hudson's silent disappointment in the kippers. Even his tobacco had remained untouched. This silence was unlike his usual moods, for there was no trace of melancholy, merely a kind of watchful pause, as though he awaited some hidden signal to snap into life. I was about to probe him with a question when a sharp knock at the door forestalled me. Mrs. Hudson entered with a raised brow and a square envelope upon her tray. "Hand-delivered, sir. From Edinburgh, if the crest speaks true," she said. Holmes took it without a word and examined the seal. A pressed thistle upon thick cream paper. I watched as he slit it with a letter opener, scanned the contents in silence, and then folded it neatly upon his knee. His eyes glittered with a sudden brightness. "Ah," he said, more to himself than to me. "So the widow finally writes." "Widow?" I echoed, for he had not spoken the word before. Holmes gave me one of those enigmatic smiles that meant he would tell me nothing just yet. "All in good time, Watson," he murmured, springing from his chair with a suddenness that startled even the fire into renewed crackling. "But first, I believe we are to receive a visitor. Do have the courtesy to tidy your notes. You may wish to record what follows." The bell rang not 10 seconds later, as though summoned by thought. She was tall, perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in black so tastefully cut that the austerity of mourning gave way to elegance. A veil concealed her features, but her posture was firm, not wilting, and she entered not like a widow collapsed by grief, but like a woman with questions yet unanswered. Beside her stood a discreet gentleman, whom she introduced as Mr. Arbuthnot, her solicitor. Holmes offered no greeting, merely inclined his head and motioned toward the empty armchair across from him, studying her all the while with those hawk-like eyes. Even before she sat, Holmes had gathered a tapestry of conclusions. Later, he would tell me that the slight drag of her left foot betrayed a recent ankle sprain, that her gloves, though fine, bore the faintest trace of writing ink, and that the fraying threads at her right cuff marked her as left-handed. "Independent means," he would add quietly, "and not Scottish by birth, too precise with her vowels." I marvelled, as always, at how a mere entrance could become evidence under Holmes' gaze. He waited until she was settled before he spoke again. "You must forgive my forwardness," Holmes said, "but when a woman has buried 4 husbands and still walks with such purpose, one cannot help but be intrigued." He turned to me then, his eyes twinkling. "The widow intrigues me, Watson. Let us hear what she has to say." And so, she began. The woman introduced herself, in a tone both composed and entirely without affectation, as Mrs. Isla Drever of Edinburgh. Her solicitor, Mr. Arbuthnot, remained standing behind her with his gloved hands folded neatly, speaking only when addressed. It was Holmes who broke the silence. "You have been recently bereaved, Mrs. Drever?" he asked. "I have," she replied, "for the 4th time." That caused me to glance at Holmes, who raised one eyebrow almost imperceptibly. My fourth husband, Sir Arthur Conan, was laid to rest this past Thursday, she continued, and I do not come here to grieve him. I come because I believe his death was not as natural as it seemed. 4 husbands, I said, before I could help myself. And each gone, she finished for me, evenly. The first 3 left no suspicion. The fourth leaves something far worse. A whisper. A doubt. Holmes steepled his fingers. Go on. Mrs. Drever did not flinch beneath the weight of her own narrative. If anything, she seemed almost clinical, as if recounting the plot of a novel rather than the history of her marriages. My first husband, Major William Lee, passed in his sleep. Heart failure, the doctor said, though he was barely 40. A soldier's wear on the heart, they suggested. The second, Thomas Hensley, a man of finance, fell ill quite suddenly with a gastric infection. It took him within days. She paused, just long enough for the silence to press in. My third husband, Charles Edington, was an art dealer. He slipped on the stairs at our home, broke his neck. It was raining that day. And there was no inquiry? Holmes asked quietly. No, she said. There was nothing to inquire. I was never accused. But after the third, there were stairs. And after the fourth, after Alistair, I sensed more than that. She turned to Holmes with the first trace of vulnerability. They think I am a curse, or worse. But I loved Sir Alistair. I believe he was murdered. Not by my hand, but murdered nonetheless. Sir Arthur Drever, she told us, had gone to bed after a modest supper and a short walk on the grounds. He had complained only of a faint headache. In the morning, the maid had found him cold. No struggle, no blood, no note. He lay there as if only dreaming, she said, her gloved fingers tightening ever so slightly in her lap. And what did the coroner declare? Holmes asked. Natural causes. Some weakening of the heart, they claimed. But I saw no signs of weakness in him. Not physically, not in spirit. He was vital, still sharp of mind and with no known illness. And he had recently revised his will. At that, Holmes leaned forward an inch. And did he revise it in your favour, madam? She hesitated. No, it was simply updated. The solicitor can show you. But I fear that someone used his trust in me to place me at the centre of a very clever scheme. Holmes was listening now in earnest. Even I had heard of Isla Drever's name once or twice in London society, spoken with a kind of morbid fascination that clung to her like trailing ivy. In Edinburgh, it appeared, the whispers had bloomed into full speculation. She is spoken of in drawing rooms and garden parties, Mr. Arbuthnot offered. Never openly, but always with a chill. They call her the Black Widow behind closed doors, a nickname rarely bestowed upon the truly guilty, Holmes murmured. But one that suffocates all the same, Isla said. I can endure pity, Mr. Holmes. I cannot endure suspicion without truth. I came to you because you do not frighten easily, and because Scotland Yard would see only scandal where you might see reason. Holmes gave a single nod, almost imperceptible. Holmes had not taken his eyes off her since she first sat. Now I noticed the faintest flicker of calculation dancing behind them. He was inventorying her, silently, as he always did. You wear your mourning with precision, he said suddenly. Your gloves are new, but hastily purchased. There is a faint trace of glue along the seam. Your accent is cultivated Edinburgh, but your vowels betray a Kentish origin. You are left-handed, though you carry your handbag on the right. And you were recently writing letters, 3 by my count. She blinked once. There is a trace of ink on your right thumb, faint but fresh. And the corner of your glove has frayed where it rests upon your writing surface. Do you find all that suspicious? She asked, not unnerved, but rather intrigued. I find it revealing, Holmes replied, sitting back. Not of guilt, but of the fact that you are not quite what you allow others to believe. And that is the beginning of every good mystery. Holmes leaned back in his chair with that air of composed amusement which always marked the moment when the case had begun, truly begun, in his mind. "Mrs. Draver," he said, "I do not know whether you are guilty, innocent, or something in between. Nor do I care, just yet." She tilted her head. "What intrigues me," he continued, "is the elegance of the sequence. 4 men, all different in station, all removed from this world by entirely distinct methods. A soldier, a banker, an art dealer, and a baronet. It is the symmetry that sings. Murder may be random, but patterns are not." He paused, the corner of his mouth lifting. "It is not guilt that interests me, madam. It is structure." Mrs. Draver said nothing for a moment. Then she inclined her head. "That is the most honest reply I have received in months." "I assure you, madam," said Holmes, "honesty is my least flexible habit." Mr. Arbuthnot produced a sheaf of documents, statements, timelines, the copy of the most recent will, and placed them carefully on the side table. Holmes ignored them for the time being. "I shall look into it," he said simply. "Do you believe me?" she asked. Holmes gave her a faint, unreadable smile. "I believe that something happened. Whether it involved you or merely followed you remains to be seen, but either way, it will leave footprints." When they had gone, Holmes stood in silence, fingers steepled, eyes distant. "I think, Watson," he murmured, "we must go north." We departed from King's Cross on a train cloaked in the kind of dour mist that seemed, somehow, appropriate to our destination. Holmes spent the journey almost entirely in silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed not upon the passing countryside, but upon something far more distant and abstract, an unseen shape assembling itself in the air before him. I, for my part, turned over the particulars of Mrs. Draver's tale in my mind. There was a certain ghastly arithmetic to it. 4 husbands, 4 funerals, and 1 woman whose expression betrayed neither guilt nor grief. In the drawing rooms of Edinburgh, she was spoken of in half tones. Elegant, dangerous, unfortunate. It was not the fact of her widowhood that disturbed society so much as the repetition of it. After the 2nd death, she was whispered about. After the 3rd, feared. After the 4th, she had become the kind of legend that mothers warn daughters about. Mr. Alfred Crowthorne was the sort of man one expects to find behind a solicitor's desk, dried at the edges, mildly yellowed, and wrapped in the scent of leather and dust. He welcomed us with the guarded hospitality of one used to discretion, but not to strangers. "The lady is not your average client," he said, after Holmes had introduced himself. "Nor, I suspect, are you average investigators." "That would be a fair assessment," Holmes replied lightly. Crowthorne produced 4 thin case files, 1 for each late husband, and laid them before us like playing cards. Major Lee died intestate, but with few assets. Mr. Hensley, the banker, had a tidy estate which passed to Mrs. Draver with little dispute. Mr. Eddington's property was mostly art, and the baronet, Sir Alister, revised his will 2 months before his death, though, curiously, not in her favour. "Curious indeed," Holmes murmured. "The estates," Crowthorne continued, "were handled swiftly and without contest. I can attest that no foul play was ever suspected by the authorities, though I did raise an eyebrow more than once. But eyebrows are not evidence, Mr. Holmes." "No," said Holmes, "but they are often where evidence begins." Later, as we walked the narrow closes off the Royal Mile, Holmes laid out the facts as though arranging bones in a dry field. A soldier dead in his sleep, a banker overtaken by gastric fever, an art dealer upon the stairs, a baronet lost to his pillow, he said, ticking them off on his fingers. Each death distinct, each plausible, but taken together. "There's a rhythm," I said quietly. "Just so," he replied. "One illness, one accident, one fall, and now a heart that ceased without struggle. No poison detected, no wound inflicted. Yet the sequence is too balanced to be natural. You believe they were murdered? I believe that someone intended them to appear otherwise, said Holmes, and I believe that whoever arranged them had a rare gift for restraint. He paused, turning to look back at the solicitor's office now receding behind us. If Mrs. Drever is the author of this tale, she is a genius. If she is merely the ink, then we must find the hand that guides her. There was a hard gleam in his eyes that made me uneasy. Holmes has always delighted in disguises that are equal parts absurd and effective. On this occasion, he donned the cloak of an itinerant parish historian, complete with notebooks, spectacles, and a fabricated interest in heraldic inscriptions. I accompanied him, somewhat more stiffly, as his nephew and assistant in lithography. The cemetery in Dean Village was oddly serene. Moss clung to the headstones like old regrets, and the wind threaded through the yew trees with a soft, continuous whisper. We moved among the graves with practiced inconspicuousness, until Holmes came to a halt before a particular row. Look, he said softly, the stones are all the same height. The engravings, though handled by different masons, share similar spacing and font. But here, observe the dates. I did. The four men had died almost precisely 2 years apart, always in the autumn, always within the span of 6 days of each other. It was chilling in its precision. And here, Holmes added, tapping a corner of Sir Alister's stone, a tiny carved fox's head, an emblem which appears nowhere on the others. Curious. Coincidence? Watson, he said, already moving on. In my experience, nothing kills with such punctuality unless it keeps a diary. It fell to me to seek out the quieter voices, the ones too easily ignored by coroners and constables. With some effort, and the application of Holmes's name, I was directed to a lodging house near Haymarket, where I found Miss Annie Forbes, formerly employed in the Drever household. She was a thin, pale thing with nervous eyes and the habit of smoothing her apron even when it was not there. I introduced myself gently, and after a few cautious remarks, she consented to speak, though her voice never rose above a whisper. There were sounds, sir, she said. After the second gentleman passed, I began to hear things at night, doors opening when no one had called, a voice, I couldn't say whose, that spoke to Sir Alister just before his death. What kind of voice? I asked. Low, careful, female, I think. He started locking his study door after that. Said people weren't who they claimed. Did he suspect his wife? She hesitated. He loved her, I think, but he feared her too, or what might follow her. When I told Holmes later, he simply nodded. We shall add the voice to our list of ghosts, Watson. It seems this house had several. We returned that evening to the solicitor's archive, where Holmes, under the pretext of examining Sir Alister's charitable associations, began cross-referencing membership rosters of certain private institutions. After nearly an hour of silent work, he gave a low hum of satisfaction. Look here, he said, sliding a thin volume toward me. Sir Alister, Mr. Hensley, and Charles Eddington, all former or honorary members of a now-defunct gathering known as the White Fox Society. I've never heard of it, I replied. You weren't meant to, said Holmes. It was a gentleman's society of the less public sort, exclusive to a fault, and notorious in whispers for its moral flexibility. Membership was passed along not by merit, but by silence. And Major Lee, no known connection, but he was a military man, easy to isolate. The others, however, share this common root. Note the dates. Each man joined, or rejoined, within a year of his death. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Holmes said, that we are no longer looking at a string of domestic misfortunes. We are looking at a list. A very old list, perhaps. One someone is finally striking through. His gaze sharpened. And Mrs. Drever may merely be the ink. Back at our lodgings, Holmes stood before the fire, his silhouette drawn in sharp lines by the flicker of gaslight. "There is something artful about this pattern," he said at last. "Too artful." "You mean it's been staged?" "Precisely. The pacing of the deaths, the variety of methods, the lack of forensic overlap. It is as though someone took great care to avoid suspicion while still constructing a coherent narrative." "And Mrs. Drever?" "She is either the architect of the tragedy," Holmes replied, "or its unwitting scaffold." He turned, eyes gleaming. "Someone is directing this sequence, Watson. That someone has patience, intelligence, and a motive yet unrevealed. The widow may have brought us the question, but I suspect the answer lies elsewhere." He paused, then added quietly, "And I intend to find it before the autumn claims a fifth." It was Holmes's habit, when entering a room once inhabited by the dead, to behave as though the dead might still be watching. He moved lightly, almost reverently, as he examined Sir Arthur Drever's study. The late baronet had been a meticulous man, books arranged by binding rather than title, inkwells topped, a globe angled to Edinburgh's latitude. Holmes stood before the large portrait of Sir Alister's grandfather, a brooding figure in powdered wig and dark robes. After a moment of contemplation, Holmes stepped upon a stool, reached behind the canvas, and pressed inward. A soft click answered him. "Watson, a man who revises his will in haste, often hides the first out of sentiment or necessity," he murmured. From the recess emerged a narrow envelope, sealed but yellowed. Holmes broke it open, and we read together. "To be opened in the event of my sudden death." The contents were astonishing. A second will, signed and witnessed, dated 2 weeks prior to the official one. It left the entire estate not to Mrs. Isla Drever, but to a woman named Agnes Blythe. Holmes smiled without humour. Sir Alister anticipated something, or someone. "And the name?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, "is a thread I intend to pull until the tapestry unravels. The search for Agnes B took us not to grand houses or legal offices, but to a modest brick building on a narrow lane in the Canongate, bearing a carved wooden sign, the Agnes Blythe Foundation for Young Women. Inside, we were greeted by the scent of old wood polish and the soft murmur of embroidery needles. A matronly woman, Mrs. Innes, informed us that the foundation was named after its original benefactor, though few now knew who she had truly been. "Sir Alister funded us for years," she added. "He was discreet, visited once a month, never spoke of the past." Holmes tilted his head. "And was there a ward here who received special attention?" Mrs. Innes frowned, then softened. "Yes, a girl he brought to us himself, Miss Clara, came here at 14. She's still with us, teaches the younger ones." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Might we meet her?" Moments later, we were introduced to a young woman with dark, level brows and that curious mix of pride and reserve one associates with private grief. Holmes studied her face intently, saying nothing until we had stepped outside. "She has Sir Alister's eyes, Watson, the Drever eyes. Whatever else she may be, she is his." We spoke with Clara Ble the following morning, under the pretext of gathering oral histories from charitable beneficiaries. She answered politely, if cautiously, never revealing more than was required. Holmes, however, was not deceived by decorum. He watched her posture, the minute hesitation before she spoke of Sir Alister, and the subtle tension in her hands when asked how she came to the foundation. "My mother was a servant," she said. "I never knew my father." Holmes folded his hands. "Did your mother work for the Drevers?" "She worked for men who wore coats like his," she said, nodding at a painted portrait in the hallway. "I doubt they remembered her name." Holmes nodded slowly. "But they remembered hers." She looked at him sharply. He continued, more gently now. "You bear the face of the Drevers. That is not conjecture, Miss Blythe, but biology. Sir Alister did not leave you that estate out of charity. He left it out of guilt, or blood." Clara said nothing. She met Holmes's gaze with a composure that bordered on defiance. then rose. "If the past interests you, Mr. Holmes, you'll find it's always behind a locked door, and some doors ought to stay shut." "Outside," I said. "Do you think she knows?" "Oh," Holmes replied, "she knows. The question is, what does she intend to do with it?" Later that day, we were granted permission to examine the Drever family portraits, which hung in a private gallery of their Edinburgh home. Portraits that, Holmes insisted, are rarely painted without vanity, and vanity is rarely blind. We walked the gallery in silence. Faces of men with strong jaws and narrow-set eyes peered down at us. Severe drivers in scarlet uniforms, judicial robes and riding coats. Near the end of the row stood Sir Alister's own likeness, painted some 20 years prior. Holmes paused at a smaller portrait adjacent to it, unlabelled and curiously unsigned. A young woman, no more than 17, with soft brown hair and grey eyes. Not Isla Drever, and certainly not any society beauty. "Uncatalogued," Holmes said, kneeling. "And here, Watson, look just beneath the frame." Scratched faintly into the wood, nearly invisible, was a sigil I did not recognise. A curled fox's head surrounded by 4 slashes. Holmes tapped it. "The same emblem as on Sir Alister's grave. You think it's linked?" "I think," Holmes said quietly, "that the Drever family had more secrets than wives, that this young woman, who bears a striking resemblance to Clara Ble, was removed from the record, but not from memory." He rose slowly. "When a family silences its past, it leaves echoes, and the clever can follow echoes to the source." That evening, we returned to our lodgings where Holmes, like a spider resuming its place at the centre of a thoughtful web, began cross-referencing Drever documents with the private society ledgers unearthed earlier in the week. It was in an old society ledger, its cover softened with age, and its ink barely legible, that he found what he had been seeking. "All 4 men, Watson," he said, laying the book before me. "Major Lee, Hensley, Eddington, and Drever, each listed as attending winter assemblies of a gentleman's circle known only in these pages as the White Fox." "I thought only 3 were confirmed," I replied. "Major Lee appears under an alias, his military code name from colonial service. Cross-referenced with army dispatches, it fits. But what does this society do?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question no one asks aloud. But I suspect it is less a club than a sanctuary for men with shared sins." He stood, stretching. "Someone has been circling the White Fox for years, Watson, marking its members, one by one. And Mrs. Drever? Perhaps bait, perhaps shield, perhaps something else entirely. But rest assured, someone has been hunting in the shadows, and the foxes, it seems, are running out." Holmes was not one to chase gossip, but when he did lend an ear to rumour, it was with surgical precision. In the days that followed our discovery of the White Fox ledger, he undertook a discreet campaign of inquiry among Edinburgh's more reticent circles, men who had once been something, and now preferred not to be remembered. He came back one evening from such an excursion with his coat dusted in rain and a gleam in his eye I had come to recognise. The White Fox Society, he said, casting his gloves onto the hearth, was not merely a fraternity of the idle rich. It was, for a time, the crucible of consequence for a number of men whose public reputations would not bear private scrutiny. He poured himself a brandy. In 1869, there was a scandal involving the ruin of a young maid in service at one of their retreats. The matter was buried, of course, names erased, funds exchanged, records destroyed, but the girl vanished. "And you think this is related?" "I think," Holmes said, "that she did not vanish. She bore a daughter, perhaps, and that daughter has grown up with memory where others had justice." He turned toward the fire. "When power commits sins in the dark, Watson, it leaves behind shadows that never forget. The question is not whether vengeance is at play, but whether it is guided by rage or reason." That night, as the rain pelted our windows and the lamplight danced upon the maps Holmes had pinned across the wall, he spoke softly but with certainty. Isla Drever, he said, tapping her name with the stem of his pipe, is not our culprit. She is a constant, present at every death, yes, but in the role of symbol, not hand. You believe she's innocent? I believe, he replied, that she was used repeatedly, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not, but she is not the one pulling the strings. Then who is? Someone who knows her movements, who understands the pattern, someone with access not only to the men, but to the myth being woven around her. He drew a circle around the phrase, fourth widow. She is the story, the thing whispered in corridors, but the true author is elsewhere, hidden behind charity, behind loyalty, behind time. He paused. She is the flame, Watson, but not the fire. I watched him as he stood by the window, his silhouette cast in fractured shadows. You have something planned, I said. He smiled faintly. I have something prepared. Now it is only a matter of timing. And what do we do in the meantime? We wait, said Holmes, for the fox to visit the henhouse once more. It was on a fog-drenched Thursday that Holmes stood before our fire, his gaze distant and calculating, as though measuring the room not in feet but in consequences. He had said little for hours. Then, as if cued by some inner clock, he turned to me and said quietly, "We shall need an invitation, and a name that no longer exists." I set down my newspaper. You have a plan, then? I have an arrangement, he corrected. There will be a supper at the White Fox Club. 2 surviving members have agreed to attend. They believe I am Sir Warwick Grantham, a baronet of minor repute and notorious discretion. You intend to provoke them? I intend to study them in the wild, Holmes said. Pretense reveals more than confrontation. Men who prey in shadows do not expect to be hunted at their own table. And the maid, she will come, Watson. Trust that. He looked at me with unusual gravity. There may be danger. You are to remain close, but out of reach. If something occurs, act without ceremony. You suspect poison. I suspect memory, Watson, and vengeance, which is often more precise. I nodded. Good, he said, drawing on his gloves. Let us go where reputations rot behind velvet curtains. And perhaps, before the night ends, someone will show their hand. The White Fox Club, once whispered of in the margins of scandal sheets and snuffed out parliamentary debates, occupied an anonymous townhouse in a narrow crescent near Charlotte Square. To the world, it was merely a gentleman's retreat, but Holmes had described it as a place where the powerful come to unburden themselves of guilt, of conscience, and occasionally of witnesses. Holmes had adopted the persona of Sir Warwick Grantham with such ease that even I, who had watched him assume dozens of guises, found myself unsettled. He moved with a languid arrogance, drawled with an Oxonian murmur, and wore disdain like a brooch. We were ushered inside by a steward whose face betrayed no expression save weariness. The entrance hall was dim, wood-panelled, and heavy with tobacco and age. Beyond it lay a dining room hung with paintings that all seemed to share the same quality. Expensive mediocrity. 2 men awaited us there. One, Judge McAllister, grey and pinched, still wearing the robes of his office. The other, a Mr. Cedric Vane, florid and jowled, who smelled faintly of lilac and gin. Introductions were made, hands shaken. I remained at the periphery, disguised as Holmes's silent valet. My role was to observe, and to act, should the need arise. Holmes seated himself between them with the ease of a serpent coiled on velvet. Let us not dwell on formalities, he said with a smile. I'm told this club serves a most unforgettable sherry, and I am a man who treasures memory. The 2 men stiffened, just perceptibly. Holmes had begun. Dinner commenced with a subtle air of performance. Each course arrived with ceremony, but the real theatre was in the eyes of the men seated round that table. Judge McAllister spoke little. When he did, it was in clipped tones, always choosing his nouns carefully, as though each one might be used as evidence against him. Mr. Vane, by contrast, filled the silence with genteel irrelevance, prattling on about fox hunting and the deplorable state of modern art. Holmes played the perfect guest, interested, amused, never intrusive. But I knew the signs. The way he tilted his head when McAllister spoke of reputation, the faint narrowing of his eyes when Vane misremembered a date. It was all being catalogued behind that impassive mask. "I confess," said Holmes between bites of soul, "I've heard the most extraordinary tale making its way through Edinburgh society, about a lady who has outlived 4 husbands. Quite tragic, or suspicious, depending on one's temperament." A silence followed. McAllister's fork paused mid-air. Vane chuckled, too quickly. "Oh, those old wives' tales," he said, waving a hand. "Morbid inventions. Women acquire husbands like hats these days. No wonder they discard them so easily." Holmes smiled faintly. "You speak as though the lady did the discarding herself." "She must have a gift for misfortune," said the judge, eyes low. "Some women do. And others," Holmes said softly, "simply attract justice, like a storm attracts lightning." Both men fell silent again. Holmes sipped his wine, and the storm clouds in that room grew thicker. The atmosphere, once faintly cordial, began to frost around the edges. The men drank more, spoke less, and flinched at shadows Holmes had not even cast. He had said little more of the widow, yet her ghost now haunted every syllable. McAllister grew terse, tugging at his collar with fingers that trembled. Vane offered increasingly absurd anecdotes, which Holmes met with indulgent smiles and brief cool laughter. "Tell me, gentlemen," Holmes said at last, with the air of one settling a wager, "do you believe in coincidence?" McAllister snorted, though not convincingly. "Coincidence is simply pattern without explanation." "Just so," said Holmes. "But 4 men dying, each tied to the same woman, and each to this club. Would that stretch your faith?" "I am a judge, sir," McAllister snapped, "not a romantic." Holmes leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes sharp as blades. "Then let me pose this. If such a woman existed, and if, say, a daughter or heir of a ruined servant decided to make an art of revenge, how would one stop her, especially if she never lifted a weapon?" There was a pause. Vane dropped his spoon. McAllister said nothing. "Silence," Holmes mused aloud, "is often the first clue that the past has entered the room." Dessert had barely been cleared when a maid entered, quiet, precise, face blank beneath a linen cap. She carried a silver tray bearing 3 glasses of sherry. Holmes watched her with the expressionless calm of a surgeon observing a tremor in the hand of a colleague. The glasses were distributed, one before McAllister, one before Vane, one before Holmes. But as the maid turned to leave, Holmes's hand darted forward, not to his own glass, but to mine, set slightly aside. With a flick of the wrist, masked as absent-minded correction, he swapped the 2. "Watson," he said aloud, though not loudly, "your glass is warmer than mine." A simple phrase, but the effect was immediate. McAllister paled. Vane stared, and Holmes raised his sherry, only to pause, sniff it, and set it down. "No," he said, "not warm. Bitter." The judge bolted upright. "What?" But Holmes was already moving. He had seized the maid's wrist with a gentleness that belied its strength. "This," he said, "is Clara Ble." The woman made no attempt to deny it. "She brought justice to your doorstep tonight, the same justice that took your friends. But poison, gentlemen, poison is a coward's signature." Clara stared at Holmes, eyes fierce and dry. "I would have let it be," she said, "if you'd only stayed silent." McAllister slumped in his chair. Holmes turned to me. "Call the yard, Watson. This case, I think, has poured its final drop. The sherry glass had not yet been cleared when the retired judge, McAllister, made a faint choking sound and lurched forward in his chair. For a moment, all motion ceased, save for the trembling of the dessert spoon still clutched in Mr. Vane's hand. Holmes rose at once, utterly composed, and knelt beside the fallen man. "Watson," he said sharply. "His pulse, if you please." I dropped beside him, fingers already at the man's neck. It was weak, irregular. "His pupils are constricting," I murmured. "Some agent, opiate-based, perhaps." Holmes nodded. From his pocket, he withdrew a small vial of ammonia and held it under the man's nose. McAllister stirred, groaned, then gasped like a man pulled up from drowning. "He will live," Holmes said curtly, "though he may wish otherwise come morning." Vane blustered. "Good heavens, you said she meant to kill you, Holmes?" Holmes turned to him with that icy calm which never failed to arrest attention. "She did," he said. "Had I not switched the glasses, it would be I in that chair." Vane gaped. "The clue," Holmes continued, "was her silence. A maid in such a society is expected to speak. Yes, sir. No, sir. Pleasantries, apologies, even gossip. But this one, Clara Ble, held her tongue like a blade." I looked at Holmes in horror. "You suspected she would strike? Tonight?" "She had to," Holmes said. "The White Fox Club will soon be scattered by scandal. If she meant to finish her work, this was her only window." Holmes rose, dusted his knees, and surveyed the trembling woman now restrained by the steward. "Alas," he murmured, "when one plays executioner, it is best not to fumble the blade." With McAllister barely conscious and Vane still stammering, Holmes moved toward the maid, no longer a spectre of civility, but a figure cloaked in the long shadow of vengeance. She stood with eerie stillness, her face pale yet defiant. "You are Clara Ble," Holmes said, "daughter of Millicent Ble, former housekeeper at Vane's estate in Berwick." She met his gaze. "I am." "You were 6 when your mother was dismissed," Holmes continued. "She had spoken, perhaps too boldly, of what she saw. A guest of the club, a young woman, injured. We can imagine the rest." "She tried to report it," Clara said, "to warn someone. But there were no ears to hear, only doors that closed." Holmes nodded. "And she died in poverty." "In shame," Clara corrected. "They said she lied, that she was unstable." Vane made a noise, but Holmes raised a hand and he fell silent. "So you followed the lives of these men," Holmes said. "Waited, watched, and when Isla Drever's string of widowhoods began, when her name began to rise like smoke, you stepped behind her, not as her hand, but as her shadow." Clara's lips curled faintly. "She made no move. She wept, perhaps, but I acted." Holmes turned to me then, as though clarifying a theory for a medical journal. "The perfect camouflage, a woman everyone watched, marrying into misfortune, and behind her, someone no one noticed." "I never poisoned the husbands," Clara said quietly. "Only tonight, only once." Holmes inclined his head, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "One blade may have done the cutting," he said, "but yours sharpened the edge." The constables arrived within the hour. Clara Ble did not resist. She walked between them with the quiet dignity of someone who had already pronounced judgment upon herself. Holmes stood in the vestibule of the White Fox Club, watching her go. His features were unreadable, but I saw his fingers tapping absently against the mahogany wainscot, an unconscious rhythm of thought. "She was right, wasn't she?" I said. "About them, about what they'd done." Holmes replied without turning. "Oh, quite. The names, the records, the women paid to disappear, all buried beneath privilege and time. But rightness is not the same as justice." I frowned. Then what is justice, Holmes? He finally looked at me, his eyes strangely gentle. Justice is a thing that breathes, Watson. It struggles, it ages, it is wounded. But it does not come in bottles, nor does it arrive on silver trays. He turned, retrieving his hat from the rack. Those men wronged her family. But had she succeeded tonight, she would have merely added one more sin to the pile. As we stepped into the lamplit fog of the London evening, I felt a peculiar weight in my chest, not for the guilty, nor even the nearly poisoned, but for the quiet, fierce maid who had tried to right a century of wrongs with a vial and a glass. Holmes paused. Come, Watson, the world is full of locked rooms, and someone, somewhere, has lost the key again, and with that, we vanished into the mist. We returned to Baker Stairs in the hour before dawn. London lay hushed under a misty pall, as though the very streets withheld judgment on the night's affair. Holmes, with his usual disregard for fatigue, cast aside his coat and settled into his armchair, the violin already in hand. I busied myself with the fire and said nothing at first. There was a gravity about him, not the solemnity of failure, but that curious stillness he displayed when his mind had arrived, decisively, at a terrible truth. He played a slow, dissonant passage, a meditation in minor key, and then abruptly lowered the instrument. She was very nearly successful, Watson, he said. Very nearly. I nodded, but not quite. He closed his eyes. No, and yet, I find no triumph in the matter. I took my seat across from him, steepling my fingers as he so often did. Holmes, I asked, how did it all begin? What thread led you back through so many deaths? He opened one eye and regarded me with the air of a schoolmaster who had just been asked how to add 2 and 2. It began, he said softly, with 4 men, one past, and a society that had sworn never to speak. Holmes set down his violin, his gaze fixed on the curling smoke from the fireplace. 4 husbands, he began. 4 seemingly disconnected men, each from a different region, a different industry, a different manner of life, and yet all married, briefly, fatefully, to the same woman, Isla Drever. I recalled their names from our case notes: Colthurst, Macready, Temple, and Venn. Each had died under circumstances that were tragic, yet, until examined together, unremarkable. Holmes continued, it was not Isla that linked them, Watson. It was not love, nor fortune, nor even lust. It was guilt, and that guilt wore a silver waistcoat and smoked Turkish cigarettes. The White Fox Society, I murmured. Holmes inclined his head. A gentleman's club, nominally philanthropic, but in practice, a sanctuary for the powerful to sin without consequence. Their motto was discretion. Their sport was cruelty. And all 4 men? I asked. Former members, Holmes said. In their youth, when such societies offered power to men who had not yet earned it, and protection to those who had already spent it. But why marry Isla? Not to marry her, Watson. To be selected. The men had no idea they were targets until they were too far in. Each believed himself in the presence of romance, when in truth he had stepped into the theatre of reckoning. A log popped in the fire. I did not suspect it until I found a receipt, Holmes said, for a wine merchant who served all 4 weddings, different cities, different years, but the same supplier. And the supplier belonged to a club in Edinburgh, the White Fox. They covered the glass, but not the stain. Holmes rose and crossed to the cabinet, withdrawing a slim folder of correspondence. He handed it to me without ceremony. Read the 3rd letter, he said. I opened it. The handwriting was tidy, almost girlish. My mother served the house of Lord Temple for 11 years. She was dismissed without pension or reference after raising concerns. I was 5. I remember the winter we spent in a workhouse in Aberdeen. She died of pneumonia 2 years later. Her name was Millicent Blythe. I looked up. Clara Blythe. Holmes said simply. The name rang now with dreadful clarity. The silent maid, the sherry glass, the tremor in her jaw as Holmes had drawn the conversation toward Ursula's fourth husband. She vanished, Holmes said. For 20 years she was unaccounted for. I traced a trail through school records, false names, even service under aliases. But she always re-emerged in proximity to one of the four men. She worked as a housekeeper's assistant for Colthurst, a flower arranger at Temple's funeral, a nursemaid at Macready's convalescence, and finally, a domestic at Venn's household, where Isla had gone to recover after her third morning. My blood ran cold. She lived alongside them, Holmes said, in the margins, in the places no one sees. But why Isla? Holmes lit a fresh cigarette. Because Isla became the common note, the melody to which Clara could attach her silent harmony. She did not trust coincidence, Watson. She trusted design. And in Isla, she found the perfect stage upon which to conduct her revenge. I shivered despite the fire. She erased herself, Holmes said, so she could rewrite others. She did not merely serve the widow, Holmes said. She mirrored her. I blinked. You mean she copied Isla Drever? In all but name, he said. Observe the chronology. Clara Ble re-enters Isla's life at the time of her second marriage. She adopts a surname similar to that of Isla's previous governess. She uses her late mother's wedding ring, cut and repolished, to mirror one Isla wore. Every outward sign was alignment. Every signal was symphony. I reached for my notebook, but surely Isla noticed. Holmes waved it away. Of course she noticed, but she mistook it for loyalty. A lonely woman, freshly widowed, finds comfort in a maid who remembers how she takes her tea, who knows her husband's scent on the linens. She would not question it. He leaned forward. Watson, Clara Ble. Ble embedded herself not only in Isla's home, but in her pattern. She predicted her choices, nurtured her friendships, directed her mourning. I frowned. Directed it? She arranged for the charity gala at which Isla met Venn. She ordered flowers on Isla's behalf for Macready's grave. She cooked meals that recalled Colthurst's palate. She wove the threads. But how did the men die? I asked. Holmes stood and stretched. She did not always wield the blade, but she placed the knife where impulse could find it. He turned to me with that familiar flicker of wry melancholy. Men haunted by guilt make dangerous husbands, Watson. They drink too much, ride too fast, trust too blindly. Clara needed only to arrange the scenery. Their sins did the rest. And the poison? Ah, Holmes said, reaching for his violin again. That, my dear fellow, was her final stanza, the crescendo, a melody composed across a lifetime and played in silence. Holmes had risen once more and stood before the mantel, one hand resting against it, his expression as distant as the moonlight upon the rooftops. You will note, he said, a pattern so precise that it borders on artifice, not the spontaneity of nature, but the orchestration of design. I nodded slowly. 4 husbands, 4 deaths, precisely one every 5 years, Holmes added. Each demise timed not only with eerie regularity, but also in accordance with a notable event in Isla Drever's personal calendar. Her first husband's death coincided with the anniversary of her parents' passing. The second, her own birthday. The third, the day she first entered boarding school. And the last, well, you saw for yourself. It was to fall upon the anniversary of her 4th engagement. I blinked. But why? To reinforce the illusion that Isla was at the centre, Holmes said. A distraction so thorough that it became misdirection itself. If all things pointed to the widow, then Clara Ble could disappear behind her like a shadow beneath a larger form. And the will? Ah, Holmes said, retrieving a bundle of notary papers. Each man revised his will within the first month of marriage. always at Clara's gentle suggestion, delivered through a whispered word to the house solicitor, or a misplaced document on a desk. The changes favoured Isla, but the impulse, that was guided. I sat back in my chair, chilled not by horror, but by the methodical precision with which each thread had been woven. "She never wielded a dagger, Watson," Holmes said, "but she drew the outline into which each death fit, with care, with patience, with symmetry." He tapped the papers once, then let them fall like fallen leaves. "Their deaths," he said quietly, "were arranged like verses in a poem, each stanza inevitable, each rhyme rehearsed." For a long moment there was silence between us, save the pop of coal and the soft creak of Baker Street's floorboards. I cleared my throat. "You sound almost admiring." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Not admiration, Watson. Precision is a blade. It matters who wields it, but I confess a reluctant respect for her intellect." He paced slowly. "Many commit murder in passion. Few do so in prose. Clara Ble had no training, no allies, no wealth. Only memory, grief, and an uncanny ability to listen where others dismissed. She harnessed the very invisibility society imposed upon her." "But Holmes," I protested, "surely no end can justify such means." "Quite so," he said. "Her victims were flawed, even cruel, but not adjudged by law. She passed judgment without trial, drew her conclusions from personal grief." He paused by the window, looking out into the pale grey of morning. "She believed she was administering justice," he murmured, "but justice requires an impartial hand. Hers was all too human, trembling, bitter, soaked in sorrow." "Then you condemn her?" Holmes turned back, his expression unreadable. "I understand her," he said. "That is not the same as forgiveness." He resumed his seat and reached for his violin once more. "We must never confuse vengeance with justice, Watson. One seeks to balance the scales. The other simply wishes to tip them until the world bleeds." I hesitated before asking the question that had troubled me most. "And what of Isla Drever?" Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that held no warmth. "Ah, yes. The widow." He rested the violin against his knee and looked at me keenly. "She claims innocence. Perhaps she believes it. But do you?" He steepled his fingers. "She never asked questions, Watson. Not when Clara reappeared. Not when old names resurfaced in odd ways. She observed the orchestration of her life as one might observe a play. From the centre stage, never wondering who built the set." I frowned. "So you believe she knew?" "I believe she knew not to ask," Holmes replied. "And that, in some cases, is the difference between guilt and complicity. A mind will turn its eye from what it fears will demand action." We sat in silence once more. The streets of London stirred below, but the room remained still. "She mourned them all," I said. Holmes played a low note. "Yes, but I've seen grief worn like velvet, Watson. Expensive, elegant, and ultimately designed to shield." He plucked another string. "Some widows are merely unlucky," he said. "Others are content to let misfortune knock, so long as it enters by someone else's hand." The lamplight in Baker Street burned low, and I found myself watching the dance of its reflection upon the brass kettle as one might study shadows in a cave, searching for meaning where none may be meant. Holmes, as usual, had returned to his violin, coaxing out some half-familiar strain with fingers that were quick but curiously gentle. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you suppose there is such a thing as justice that lives beyond the reach of courts?" He did not answer immediately, nor did he look at me. The bow moved across the strings with that precise, unfeeling grace which I had come to recognize as his form of meditation. "Justice, my dear Watson," he said finally, "is often the child of coincidence and the orphan of law. I find the whole affair unsettling, I murmured. So much pain carried by silence. So many secrets buried under the respectability of clubs and marriages. And yet, Holmes replied, it is within such silences that the sharpest truths are born. I sat back and warmed my hands, unsure whether I felt sorrow or satisfaction. There's a kind of morality, I said softly, that haunts those who live beside secrets. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, and a rarer kind, still in those who survive them. It was never about Ila Draver, Holmes remarked as he leaned back in his chair, nor even about the men who died. This case, Watson, was about symmetry and influence, the ability to create a design and persuade others to inhabit it. I considered his words. You mean Clara Ble? Holmes nodded. She did not merely clean the silver or pour the tea. She arranged the chairs of fate and invited the guests to sit. Each man's downfall was not an act of passion, but a move in a deliberate sequence. She never struck the blow, but the fall was hers to trigger. Then she is the true architect. Indeed, one may borrow another's roof or name, but only the architect sees the whole design. He set the violin aside. It is not the one who holds the dagger, he said, but the one who chooses the moment it is drawn, who bears the deeper guilt. She has left for Switzerland, I said, folding the note that had arrived that morning. Holmes glanced up with mild interest. Zurich, Geneva, a private clinic apparently, for her nerves. He gave a soft snort. How fashionable! I read again the elegant script, penned in Isla Drever's unmistakable hand, gracious, evasive, and untouched by self-recrimination. She makes no mention of the past, I noted. Nor of the future, Holmes added, which is perhaps the greater omission. What do you make of it? He was quiet for a moment, then replied, there are those who flee because they fear discovery. Others flee because they fear they may not be able to discover themselves. You think she's running from guilt? I think she is running from clarity. He rose to stoke the fire, then stood still as the flames flared. In some ways, he said softly, she was the only one left alive who knew everything, and yet dared not name any of it. You seemed rather touched by her, Holmes, I ventured, watching him with narrowed eyes. Almost moved. He raised one brow and resumed tuning his violin. Touched, Watson, is the state of a man caught in the rain without an umbrella. I, on the other hand, observed the storm from a dry vestibule. I chuckled. Still, I believe I caught a flicker of pity in your tone. Possibly indigestion, he replied, though the Swiss do make excellent chocolate. He drew the bow across the string once more. Emotion clouds judgment, he said coolly, which is why I leave it, whenever possible, to others. The doorbell rang, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes accepted it without comment and opened it with the flick of a fingernail. He read it once, then passed it to me, with an amused glint in his eye. 2 words, I said aloud. Norwood. Urgent. Holmes stood and reached for his coat. Lestrade again, he said with dry affection. I do hope it's not another goose-related matter. I laughed. Will we never have peace, Holmes? He held the door for me with mock gallantry. Peace, my dear Watson, he said, is the brief interval between telegrams. Holmes sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the faintest trace of amusement flickering in his eyes. You see, Watson, he murmured, guilt does not always dwell in the hand that wields the dagger. It often resides in the silence that permits it. I stirred uneasily. Do you believe she knew all along? He considered. She knew enough, and sometimes that is precisely the threshold between innocence and complicity. He reached for his violin. Justice wears many faces, but truth, my dear fellow, is always singular. What do you think? Was the widow a bystander, or the quiet architect of every husband's fall? Let me know your theory in the comments. If you enjoyed this mystery and Holmes' final verdict, don't forget to subscribe for more cases steeped in smoke, shadows, and deduction. And do share this tale with someone who loves a clever twist as much as you do.